Hello and welcome back to the Conversation Cabinet. Today we're very fortunate to be joined by Vinay Kapoor from the Free Speech Union. Vinay, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us.
Could you give everyone who's listening at home a little introduction of who you are, who you work for, and what the Free Speech Union stands for?
Yeah, so I'm Vinay Kapoor. I'm officially, it's a long-winded job title. I'm the Events and McTaggart Program Assistant at the Free Speech Union. I'll explain what that
That's a
means.
mouthful.
Yeah, it's quite hard telling people that. So I'll break it down. So basically, I help with our events. So we do events all across the country. So I help out on the ground at those events. So it's quite fortunate because I get to travel the country quite frequently, go to places where all our members are. But the more prescient and I would say a bigger thing I'm involved in is our youth outreach. So we run this funding program called the McTaggart Program, and it's a funding program for 16 to 30-year-olds to get more interested in free speech and open debate. So I help administer that. And as a result, we're now conducting an outreach project, and this is what I'm doing full time. And we're trying to get more young people interested in free speech. We're going to travel to different universities. We want to hear from different people to hear their sorts of different opinions. So that's what my job, that's what it means. In terms of what the FSU does, well, I've already used the abbreviation Free Speech Union. We're a mass membership, non-partisan organization. Again, another mouthful for all the legal people. But what we do is we have members. So we have nearly over 40,000 members and they join us. And what we do if in return is if they have any free speech problems, they can come and contact us. We have a case team. We have a legal team. We run events. But more recently, we've begun campaigning for free speech change across the country, partly because of the litany of free speech problems that we think exist across the country. So we're a broad tent, we're a broad church. We do a lot of different things, but we've been going for 5 years now. And I would say, not being biased, because I think a lot of people, even who didn't like us 5 years ago, would say this, that we are now the leading free speech group in the UK. So that's what we do.
When you say free speech problems, for those who aren't familiar with the FSU, could you explain a bit more about what you mean?
Yeah, so we were founded in 2020, so it's 5 years ago. And at the time of our founding, our founder, now Lord Young, because he was appointed to the House of Lords by Kemi Badenoch in January this year, noticed that the country is kind of facing a kind of political and social change in the sense that people are fundamentally being cancelled. So the problem at the time was cancel culture, which maybe might seem like a dead term now, but back in the day was really pressing. So what you saw across the country in universities, in the workplace, in random things like people working for trading companies, like there was random niche examples, like everyday people were being cancelled, losing their jobs, facing discrimination because of the fact that they have a legal right to their opinions, but certain people in positions of power in HR didn't like what they had to say. So that was a big problem because we thought that people have the right to those opinions. They might be, people might disagree with those opinions, but that's part of existing in a society. But no one was standing up for them and they were just losing their jobs or they were getting kicked out of uni or they were being cancelled by their friends. They're being ostracized, like these crazy social things that were happening to people. And we think, and we thought, we still think, although we think that these problems are, we've done a lot to fix these problems. They still exist, but we've done a lot to fix them. We think that's a massive issue for a society that's supposed to be a democracy, a society that's supposed to believe in the rights of the individual to have free speech. We're in the UK where we have this tradition. We're one of the leading countries in the world. Yet if people are being fired for their opinions, then something's wrong there. Not to make it dramatic, rather it's more conceivable. We think these problems have actually got worse in the last few years because now what you're seeing is people are getting arrested for things that they're tweeting online. So that's become an increasing problem. So this whole beast of free speech problems has revealed itself to the world, and we are trying to fight we're fighting a lot of fires on those fronts. So that's a small summary of the quote problems that we think are going on at the minute.
You talked a bit about the council culture, and I'm just intrigued because I think mostly council culture comes from social media, and I think that, would you not say that's more, or would you say that the Free Speech Union should be doing something to pressure the social media companies to help people express their freedom of speech without being either fired or removed from the internet? Is there something the Free Speech Union should be doing there? Or do you think their main priority is assisting people who have already lost something due to cancel culture?
Our concern is more on the real life effects of cancel culture. And what I mean by that is, say someone, and this has happened multiple times in various cases that we've dealt with over the last Because obviously I can't go into details, but these things have happened. We're not making these things up. We wouldn't exist if there was no problem.
Yeah.
And we wouldn't be so popular. Where people have lost their jobs for things that they've said. And we don't think, after looking at, consulting our case team, and eventually if our legal team thinks it's worthy of legal action, we've been able to get people payouts from employment tribunals. We've had companies admit there's been unfair dismissal. We've had it go to the press. These things now are increasingly, people are waking up to the fact that these sorts of things are happening. So therefore our issue is with the real world effects. Like, we want to help our members get through these things, because I think when these sorts of things happen, at the time, 5 years ago, we're in a position where no one would really support them. So imagine you're a teacher and you criticize diversity training, for example, which was increasingly and still is, coming in force into schools. And the school goes, well, you can't, well, that's racism, or that's some sort of like means of silencing someone where there's not actually a serious debate. There's no implication that they want to have a serious debate either. Okay, so imagine you just lose your job like that. Your job's gone. What are you going to do? Do you want to take legal action? Do you want to find another job? What about if you have a family? Like, what we do is we help ordinary people. We help the everyday person, people who weren't before this political, people who were just trying to live their lives, but then these issues came and stopped them. So that's what we do. But that's what our concern is. We believe when it comes to social media, people have, people have lawful free speech. People can say what they want on social media. There are definitely social effects to cancel culture. But if there are social effects to cancel culture, then we want to help the people. We want to support people, in the situations that they're in. The social effects are just a byproduct, of the mob. That's just going to happen. And, that's part of being in a free society.
What would you say to someone maybe from the left who would say someone's right to say something or is just as valid as someone's right to be offended? How do you take that into consideration in these cases?
Yeah, well, it's the point you make is a kind of big criticism that comes, especially from progressives, post-structuralists who say that speech has a real world effect. Like, if I say something, I could conceivably, discursively offend someone. But to quote Jordan Peterson, who I think dealt with this incredibly well, and Kathy Newman put the exact same argument to him, he said, in order to think, you have to risk being offensive. So eventually, maybe in this conversation, but I hope not, it's not my aim, I might risk offending you, both of you, with something that I say.
You haven't
that
just
doesn't
yet,
mean
though.
I'm trying to do it. Do you know what I mean? I'm not going out of my way to think, how can I piss Josh to eat? I'm not trying to do that. But in order for me to think and speak and be a human being with individual liberty and thought and get somewhere in my life, I have to risk doing that. So that's what I would say is, that question doesn't really matter, because are you just going to stop talking? Okay, you could do that, but I don't think you're going to get anywhere. And that's what we're trying to say is we think there's a lot of arbitrary regulation because people prize offense. But if you actually delve into what that means, I think the whole arguments for what it means to be a free human being in a liberal democratic world just fall apart completely.
I think you have a very valid point there. But when governments will say that, or people will pressure the government to put hate speech laws in or something to limit that kind of freedom of expression on the internet, what's your opinion against that? As in, what do you think? Do you think that's a hate speech is something that should be recognized? As in, obviously, it's not the same as incitement to violence, but do you think that hate speech should be recognized and the Free Speech Union should do something against that as well, or is it?
Yeah, I me's these kind of questions open up what I call like philosophical minefields, and I will delve through the minefield and kind of explain. So as an organization, we condemn incitement to violence. We use the Brandenburg test, which is an American test from the 1960s from a Supreme Court case that says that speech has to have to incite violence. Like, it has to have a conceivable, effect on inciting violence. Now, that itself is a debate. That's what the courts debated about in America, what that means. So because we think we should go back to the Americans who have a First Amendment tradition, we should look at how they've wrestled with these arguments. So that's the point about violence. In terms of harm and hate, these words are very important words. But if you probe at them, I think they are very subjective. So I might say, Josh, your hair is like terrible, something. And you might think, depending on your feeling, you might think, oh my God, my hair's terrible, like whatever. Or you might think, who's this guy telling me my hair is terrible? It depends on your
of
psychological
course.
state.
It's very subjective.
Exactly, like your position in life and what you're thinking about your hair, if at all, for you to render like the
All the
idea
time.
of offense in that. Do you know what I mean? I think your hair actually looks quite nice, but what
Thank
I'm
you very
saying
much.
is that people might not think that and may risk offending you to come back to that. So that's the first thing. These problems actually manifest themselves at the individual level. Okay, now the problem with hate speech laws is then the hate speech laws are trying to govern the whole country. So this is I've just given you a micro level example. If we put that to the macro level, that falls apart even more because you get legislation that's very vague and arbitrary. For example, some hate speech laws saying you can't cause offense, distress, and harm and alarm, or some kind of like these terms that seem very intersubjective, i.e., as a society, we might understand what it means. But when you actually probe at the word harm, what does harm mean? Especially if harm is framed in a discursive way. So what I mean by that is physically, if I punch Josh, I'm physically harming him. I'll get arrested for like grievous bodily harm or something like that. If I say, Josh, your hair's like crap, that's me maybe discursively harming you. But again,
feel free to use Ethan as an example as well.
Sorry, I will after. Don't worry. It's not two-tier. Trust me. We'll be inclusive to everyone and be equitable and so forth.
I'm scared now.
At the same time, how do you police that? And then the police get into problems because then when the police turn up and go to Graham Linehan this week, so you've broken this hate speech law and you've harmed people. Okay, what does that mean? Do you know what I mean? Like what? And then the police, and then you get the government going, oh, maybe we should repeal this, and then you just get the mess because what it is that when you define harm as anything that's non-physical, you open up a minefield. So that's our problem. Is it actually really falls apart when you try to govern it.
Is it more about what you say, or is it about consciously your intent behind what you say? Which is more important
in terms of
these cases? In these cases, when deciding the outcome,
what you say versus the intention. Well, I think both are important. I think if you call for violence and you say like, okay, now we'll use Ethan. Say I'm going to kill Ethan, right?
Whoa, a bit of a step up
if
there.
I pose a conceivable okay, if I'm behind a Zoom screen, then maybe and you're on the other side of the country, that's not going to happen. If I live next door, then maybe there's a conceivable harm to that. So there could be. That's using the Brandenburg test to see how conceivably I am likely to harm you. So intent is important, but I also think something else to bring in, which is not to distract from the point, I think it's also important to bring in, is the idea that kind of human beings live in a society where offense is inevitable. So if I said my offensive things, so if I said, sexist or racist things, the world, assuming the world we live in now, isn't going to go, wow, yeah, I agree. They'll probably go, you're an idiot, right? So if you let people say their offensive things, you'll get criticized for that. And that's part of free speech. Freedom of speech isn't without criticism. Freedom of speech isn't without consequence. And therefore, I think that's better than dealing with the arbitrary regulation of free speech. So if you just let people say their stupid things, you'll get punished by the world. That's better than trying to arbitrarily regulate it, because then you open up this new minefield, this new problem, which I just spoke about. So that's what I would say.
I think almost a perfect example is that new Jubilee episode where a guy was talking about an autocratic society, and I forgot the guy's name who did the interview, but he was essentially letting him unpack it himself, and he was effectively just saying what he wanted to say, and he didn't stop him from saying anything. But then he just kind of unraveled how he was almost wanting an autocratic society. But I think that ties into this question of, do you think there is something as too much free speech? It's similar to, talk about the hate speech question, but is there something that could overstep a line of free speech?
Or is it just that incitement to violence?
I think
that's what the line is.
Yeah, I mean, for me, in a personal capacity, that's kind of where I stop. Is I think if I say I'm gonna kill Ethan or kill Josh or whoever, whoever it is, whatever day it is, depending on how I feel, whatever, then that's imminently, if it's conceivably posing a threat to your life, then I think that's where we stop. There are some people who are absolutists who believe you should be able to just go on till the cows come home. Another restriction is on libel. So if I say something unfair about you and that's found to be proven false, it goes to a court. It actually, proves distress and harm to my life. I.e., imagine if I ran a hate campaign against someone else, not you two, let's just use someone else, X person that I secretly resent and want to make lies up about them, and I drag their name through the mud and they take me to court and sue me, and the judge finds that I've actually, ruined their life because of all the... That's fair, that I think is completely fair. So libel, incitement to violence, I think are the two main ones. Other people don't agree with that. For us, FSU, incitement to violence, you can look on our website for all the specifics. We defend people's lawful right to free speech. But again, these are genuine concerns people have about where does the line end. The other thing to bring up is I think in the world today, we are asking ourselves that question of, if we frame harming in a more discursive way, that's going to create more legal questions about what is actually harm. Can you regulate it at a macro level and so forth?
I think it's fair to say, on a side note, that most of the people getting cancelled are typically to the right of the political spectrum. And so what would you say to people who would accuse the FSU of, I don't know, almost defending them and seeming almost kind of partial in that way? Because obviously you say you're impartial. What would you say to that sort of criticism?
Well, I'd point out that we don't just help the right. I think the right's a very vague term in the world of today. We help many, many people from to please the HR people, a very diverse range of backgrounds. And that's actually true. That's not a lie. Since the advent, you could say, of kind of gender critical beliefs in response to, the debates about transgender ideology, transgender ideas, and so on and so forth, we've had a massive amount of casework and case issues on that issue. And that topic is a left-wing debate within feminism, which you could say leans more to the left. And the reason why I use the word left is because a lot of the people we're helping, gender critical feminists, are left-wingers. So they don't like the right. They don't like conservatism. Why would a feminist like conservatism? There's kind of contradictory. It's quite interesting to think about it like that. They're a feminist. There are obviously many debates within feminism. They believe that biology is important. They take an essentialist reading of gender. The people who disagree with them don't think that. And they've got into a lot of fighting about that. And we believe that people have the right to express gender critical views. That's now that after the Maya Forstater case, that's also been proven because under the Equality Act, that's a protected characteristic. Those people are not from the right. Those people are not conservatives. You've had this weird, it's such a mess sometimes. I think, why, when I go to conferences and events and dinners and things, I'm like, this is so weird that we have conservatives and old Marxists and gender critical feminists all in the same room. Like, when would that ever have been possible? But because of what's going on, culture wars and cancel culture and so forth, this political spectrum is becoming a bit more fluid, for lack of a better term. The other thing I would say is to talk about the left for a minute. On the issue of Israel and Palestine, a lot of pro-Palestine people have realized that even if they've been more to the left, that they actually need free speech as well. So it's not. Okay, so after October the 7th, there was a lot of protesting on both sides, but especially on the Palestine side, especially when the war started. And certain universities and organizations would fire people because they had pro-Palestinian beliefs. But we would defend those people equally as people who have pro-Israel beliefs, So it's, I think the pro-Palestinian people also realizing that they need free speech as well. Everyone needs free speech. This is not a right-wing thing. This is not for the Nazis, as like far left people like to say. I don't think the Nazis believed in free speech. So I think this is what I'm saying is we believe, and I believe, that free speech is genuinely an apolitical issue. It transcends political boundaries. And I think we're seeing that right now with all the debates going on about cultural stuff, but also about Palestine action, having beliefs on Gaza and all these things. Those are more left wing. You could say more people hold those beliefs are left wing. So it's apolitical. It's a bit more fluid.
Similarly, would you say that the bigger threats are coming from law or from culture? I mean, you might have already answered that, but just to kind of narrow it down a little bit.
I think, as an organization, we've increasingly been campaigning against, quote, bad law, arbitrary law. So the Online Safety Act is something that we're quite opposed to, not because we want kids to be viewing pornography, as some people have been trying to criticize with saying, you like rapists and you want to support pedophiles. And it's like, why would we want to do that? Why would we want to waste our time on something ridiculous like that? But at the same time, if you can't see things that are being posted on Twitter in a, quote, free society, where Keir Starmer tells Donald Trump to say, we've had free speech for a really long time, yet people can't see things on Twitter, that's terrible. We're against that for those reasons. We're campaigning against arbitrary instruments used by the police, like non-crime hate incidents, which when you actually delve into that, I don't think makes any sense. What's a non-crime hate incident? How can you commit a non-crime, but then the police have a record of it and it could affect your job and they show up at people's doors? Like, that doesn't make sense. So we're trying to campaign against that. And there's been a lot of high-profile cases, such as the Alison Pearson case, Lucy Connolly's case, which is on a whole separate playing field, but again, relevant to these things. So there is bad law. Having said that, there is also good law, like the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which was implemented by the Labour government after Labour said, no, actually, you know what, I think we'll just remove all the important bits. And then we said, no, we'll take you to judicial review if you don't implement it. And then now they've implemented it. So there is good law. So I think what we really want to do is suggest good law, something maybe like a British First Amendment, like entrenched free speech provisions. But that's hard when the government, again, is following this sort of like agenda to mitigate harm, which you can't actually do, as I've kind of established before. At the same time, when it comes to culture, I was just going to say on culture, I wouldn't say the tide is turning, but people are at least waking up. You know, we have nearly 40,000 members. This week, we had nearly 400 people join in one day, a day after Graham Linehan was arrested when he came back to the UK. You know, on other issues that we think are free speech issues, like deciding what a woman is, you know, people have the right to believe what they want on that, but the law's being pretty clear. I think more people are waking up to that. You know, like people are now having these discussions. Coming back to the world as well, the Americans are very interested in what's going on here. JD Vance is very interested. Farage,
yeah, you could see it in the discussion with the congressman and versus Farage, and it was mentioned there as well. So it's clearly very relevant at the moment.
Yeah, so it's both. So that's what we're trying to do on both fronts.
One thing I'd ask is a slightly difficult one. I'm not expecting you to answer this in full, but do you think there's a future where we can build a culture that tolerates disagreement fully?
I wish. I'd love to. You know, that's my that's my job. You know, that's what I'm trying to do.
Then you'd be out of a job.
Among the young people is, you know, re-embed, or in brackets, re-embed the idea that debating and disagreeing is normal. And I think it's actually really important to make that apolitical and not to go, oh my God, for the last 20 years, woke people have like done this. Because the right has done no shortage of free speech censoring as well. You know, so this is apolitical, as I say. So I think we really need to do that. And that's exactly what we're trying to do with our McTaggart program, with our outreach to universities, to young people and so on, is to say that, you know, debating and discussion is a good thing, not because of our own interests, you know, not because of like, these are some dodgy companies trying to make money. What? You know, that's when you actually delve into that, it doesn't really make any sense. Rather, because if you're a young person, especially if you're a young person and you're interested in the world, if you're trying to navigate a world that I think is insanely confusing, where we're having these debates about things that we didn't debate about before, which I think is a good thing. We need to have debates about these things. Politically, we don't know what is going on. This whole mess that is 2025 and everything like that. The least you could do is say what you think. How are you going to do that if you don't have any free speech? You know, like, how are you actually going to do that? So I think it's actually important to make these things selfish and self-centered and think, how as I, as an agentic individual with potential in life, how am I going to get anywhere if I can't think? So I think we can get to that stage if we just calm down a bit and we just go, okay, you know, now we figured this out. Or maybe people are placing tweets. Okay, fine. All right, let's calm down. Let's try and talk. I'm not saying let's be agreeable and like naive to the real problems that are there, but we need to transcend the noise. That's kind of an idea I kind of think about a lot, and just think, okay, how much of this is important? Let's just, for the sake of our own flourishing, let's actually talk. Otherwise, you know, bad things will happen, for lack of a better term. So I really am optimistic.
Do you think that the freedom of speech has been preserved in universities? Because they're supposed to be places where you can talk academically and debate, and you know, it's intellectual debating. But has that remained? And if not, then what are you guys doing? Did you also see that personally in Warwick? Yeah.
Oh yeah. So I was going to
draw. Good point.
On Mike's being at Warwick, where I just left, and my observations on as FSU and as an ex-student. I think I would say that things have got better. The reason why I say that is because of the higher education bill. And that was actually used for the first time a few months ago when the Office of Students fined Sussex University, Kathleen Stocks University, hundreds of thousands of pounds for the way they treated her, for the way she was so like brutally just like, again, come after by the mob. That's not freedom of speech. That's, you know, that's, you know, people have the right to freedom of speech, but she didn't have the right to freedom of speech there because they got rid of her. Do you know what I mean? Like, she had to resign because of the hell that students and other people had caused. So it's good that that exists. That's a helpful thing. I think the culture is changing because people are realizing that they actually need debating. People need debating. This is not a thing for the far right. This is not a tool for Nazis. Like, this is actually something that everyone needs in order to think. So I think people are realizing that. The other thing is that back in the day, when I mean back in the day, I mean like 5 years ago, back in the day when students would, the first instances of no platforming, people trying to hold events, the university would cancel it for the reasons that I was criticizing earlier about offending people. The thing is back then they could do that because there were no organizations really to stand up against it. There was no the media weren't really caring about it and everything. But I think people realize that these things are actually conceivable threats to free speech. And then now the FSU, not to plug the FSU, but I will because this is what we do. If people have problems at universities, they should come and talk to us. We've helped students in these positions all the time. Sometimes we've filed subject access requests so we can actually see what the universities are thinking. We've gone after them legally. We've gone after them in the media. Like, we will defend the PR members if we think there's a conceivable case to doing that. So there's the pressure. And also the other thing is every time something like this happens, there's a massive media outcry. Something like this happens, we'll kick a fuss about it. Other organizations will kick a fuss about it because this shouldn't be happening now. It's the whole point of this bill. So having said that, I really think, and this is not me trying to be like play culture wars, I just genuinely think this, on certain issues, there's still massive fear of discussion, especially on gender, despite the fact that there are a kind of small inkling of gender critical young women slowly like coming out the closet, revealing themselves to the world. I think thanks part to the brave work of my friend and colleague Connie Shaw, who has been a big campaigner on this. People are slowly starting to come out. But I really still think this is taboo, especially in social circles. And I think on Israel and Gaza, like, that's insanely politicized at universities. And there's a genuine, there's a lot of stuff happens if you don't conform to those beliefs or if you out them publicly. So I think those two are really, 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 we need to encourage more discussion on them. So we help that with our funding program, with our universities, by just trying to chill a bit and help people and so on.
I mean, you summed that up perfectly. I think that's all we have time for today. But Vinay, thank you very, very much for being on with us. Really appreciate it. It was a very intellectual discussion.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Awesome.